Welcome to episode 174 of the Pharmacist Voice podcast. I'm the host, Kim Newlove. Today is the last episode in my Back to School series, which features interviews with 9 pharmacists who teach online courses. Today, I am the guest on my own podcast. I have a new online course coming out this fall. It is called A Behind the Scenes Look at the Pharmacist Voice podcast. Instead of making this show a solo show where I talk about the course alone, I invited a friend, Dr. Alex Barker, founder of the Happy PharmD. He's going to interview me about the course. If you are a pharmacist who is interested in starting a podcast, you need to listen to this episode. Please stick around after the interview for more information and a brief wrap up of the whole entire Back to School series. The show notes for this episode are on thepharmacistvoice.com. Just click on the podcast tab and search for episode 174. Thanks for tuning in. Now, here's my conversation with Dr. Alex Barker. Hi, Alex. Welcome to the Pharmacist Voice podcast. How are you?
Thanks for having me. I'm doing really good.
Glad to hear it. It's summer. How's your summer been?
Oh, it's fantastic. Michigan weather during the summer is beautiful every day. Usually doesn't get over 90. Um, it's just been fantastic. So it's going well. Oh, and we have a puppy. So that's exciting for me. That gets me out of my house and going on frequent walks. So it's good.
I'm jealous. If I got another dog, it would be a retriever of some sort. What kind of puppy do you have?
Oh, I have a corgi, and she is as sweet as a button. Um, but yeah, I had a golden retriever as well growing up, and I mean, she loved people to her own detriment and would constantly whine. And oh man, she was just so sweet.
They are loving dogs,
Yes.
and they are eager to please.
Yeah, it's nice to have people like that around you.
Hey, I could learn a thing or two from that dog.
Yes.
But yes, he is no longer with us. His name was Bond,
Oh.
B-O-N-D, Bond. Yep. And he had 3 legs by the time he passed away. He was a 3-legged golden retriever because he had bone cancer.
Aw.
Yeah. Yep, but I'm sure that won't happen to your corgi. Best wishes for...
I wasn't
Best
thinking
wishes for a
about it
healthy
until
life.
you said it. Thank you. Yeah.
Yes, now
Goodness.
you're going to... Yeah, now you're going to be paranoid. No, I'm just kidding.
No, I'll forget it as soon as we're moving on to the next non-cancerous subject.
All right, let's move on to a non-cancerous subject then. Alex, I invited you to be on my podcast today to interview me about my new online course, which is a behind-the-scenes look at the Pharmacist Voice podcast. So I'm excited to have you interview me about it. But first, for anyone who has not heard of you, who are you, Dr. Alex Barker, and what are you all about?
Oh man, who am I? I'm a guy. That's probably one thing I am. I also created something called the Happy PharmD, which is a career coaching and curriculum development company. We help pharmacists and students get into jobs that they love in pharmacy, and it's a ton of fun. We change lives, we save marriages and families, and we kind of fight against that mental health crisis in the workplace. It is just a crazy blessing to be able to do what I'm doing, and I love every minute of it.
Thanks for the introduction and congratulations on your success. I'm happy that you are a Happy PharmD.
Yeah. It's very much an academic job that I get to do. I teach, I speak, I do coaching, and it's just without the institution. So there's not as much bureaucracy or politics in what I do. So it's, I like that. I only have to deal with my BS.
Thanks for keeping it PG too, by the way.
Oh yeah, sure.
Awesome. Well, Alex, you'll be back on the podcast September 23rd for a one-on-one interview that involves me talking to you about your own stuff. So this is
Sure.
you talking to me about my stuff
Hey.
today. We'll turn the tables in September.
We get to tease people. What's the magic
Yeah.
sauce and what's the voice? Yeah, that sounds fun. But it's about you
Yeah.
today, right?
Yes, indeed.
So why did you want to create a course? Everyone seems to be creating courses these days. Why now? Why do you want to do it?
This current course I created because I have had so many people ask me about starting podcasts that I felt like I needed to do something about it. And doing something about it to me was making an online course.
So a lot of people reach out. They're like, "Hey, you did this. I want to do it too." I actually know the some of the grandfathers of the podcasting industry, the people behind the scenes that taught people the magic of podcasting, like Cliff Ravenscraft. I'm not sure if you ever heard of him, but there's a lot of people in that space. Daniel Lewis, not Daniel Day Lewis, the actor, but Daniel Lewis, the Art of Podcasting, I believe is his podcast. So
The
the
audacity to
yeah,
podcast.
oh yeah, that's right. I listened to that way back in the day. So there's already people out there doing it. Why you?
Okay, why me? Because I have experience. I've published, by the time this will be out in the airwaves, I've published more than 170 podcast episodes, and that includes more than 70 interviews, most of which that have been with pharmacists. I would like my target audience to be pharmacists. Nobody knows what a pharmacist needs like a pharmacist, but this is not how to start a podcast. This is what's behind the scenes of my podcast. How do I make my podcast? And I also talk about the ingredients that are involved in making a podcast. And I ask critical thinking questions that will help pharmacists decide if they want to start a podcast or not. This online course is more about helping pharmacists decide if they want to start a podcast or not,
Mm.
rather than actually starting one. That's why it's behind the scenes. A lot of times, we medical people like to see one before we do one.
That's actually really insightful because most people make the assumption that everyone wants to do this. But in a way, you're almost kind of dissuading some people by showing them, because once people really realize the work that's involved with a podcast, it's not as easy as just, hey, you have a conversation with someone and other people will want to listen too. There's a lot more to it.
You're spot on. The description that I have for the course right now, I'm just going to read it to you because I totally don't have it memorized, but here we go.
Sure.
Many pharmacists want to start a podcast, but they don't know what's involved. So they leave it on their to do list for months or years. I help pharmacists finally decide if they want to start a podcast or not so they can focus on other goals and interests. This course will save them time, money, and frustration and help them avoid common podcasting pitfalls.
So it's stepping your toes in the water. Yeah, it's kind of like, what does it feel like? And hopefully the water's warm instead of cold, which it always seems to be cold whenever I test with the water. And then I don't want to jump in. Everyone right now sees the opportunity of the Wild West of authority and expertise. And everyone and their mother is creating a course on how to do something. And many of them are great. Some of them are bad. And the rest are about in the middle. And I think it's easy to create something showing people how you did it to provide inspiration, education, and those things are good. They're definitely needed. But we have to call out something here. You are successful. You've created something and it's done really well for itself. So much so that people come to you and say, how can I do it too? And there's this idea of success bias, right? When people are considering different paths, talking to someone who's already done it, they are biased to whatever it is that they have done that has been the most successful. This is one of my problems with coaches, is that a lot of people become coaches because they did something, when in fact their coaching service is mainly just them telling their clients what they did to be successful. And the truth is, no one can copy someone else's success path. No one can be Kim Newlove. No one. No one can ever amount to what Kim Newlove is. And that's not, coaching, that's not education. But in this case, for those people that are interested, should they go into it thinking, if I just do what Kim tells me to do, then I too can be an amazing podcaster?
My response to that would be that everybody I've talked to about this course has a preconceived notion about what it is based on the title and based on where they sit with their experience with podcasting, whether they've started one, whether they want to start one, whether they've failed at launching one and pod faded.
Yeah, sure.
Everybody's yeah, I'm sure you can imagine. I've got all kinds of people with opinions. And I know that you're speaking from your coaching background, your podcasting background. You've got your own background, and I get it. And everybody that I talk to has got a little bit different background. And I understand that the way I package this and the way I market it and talk about it is going to be very important. I do talk about the why. You have to have a why for your podcast. There's no way around it. I wanted to use my podcast as an extension of my business. I have a business with a podcast. And why did I start it? For a lot of reasons, really. Aaron Albert told me, oh my gosh, audio production. I pitched Aaron Albert to narrate some of her books into audiobooks, right? And she said, oh, audio production? You should have a podcast. And I said, well, what makes you think that? And she said, well, it'd be so easy for you. But, I love Aaron Albert, but she didn't really share the why behind podcasting. That is definitely something I talk about in my course. I use my podcast as an extension of my business. It's branding and marketing, but it's also relationship building. It's networking. That is my why behind the podcast. What's in it for me? What's in it for the listener? What do I want the listeners to do with the information? I talk about all of this in the course. Everybody needs to have a why.
That's good. If people don't come at it from a why perspective, then it's not going to mean anything.
Mm-hmm.
I think it's important to note with the why that it's good to be selfish with whys. Maybe that's not what you say in the podcast, right? Like, I'm doing this to make more money.
I actually have at least 2 podcast episodes where I talk about my why, and I don't have them with me right now. I could pull them up. I have a production list here of everything. I think it's number 24, if I remember right. But yeah, I talk about why I started a podcast. Exactly. It's podcast episode number 24. I've referred to it more than once. And then I had another one recently where I talked about my why again. And I think the why is so important that I have a whole entire module about it. It's why start a podcast. I give an intro where I talk about what they're going to learn. Tell them what you're going to tell them before you tell them, right?
Yeah.
That's the intro.
Yeah.
And then we talk about what a podcaster gets out of having a podcast, what listeners get out of having a podcast, what's in it for them, and what every podcaster wants listeners to do with their content. And the critical thinking exercise at the end is, what's your why? Now, I share my why up in the welcome message, like why I have a podcast.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, I think I also mentioned that in why start a podcast in the intro. I don't have the full notes here. This is just the outline, but there's a lot in this course, and I share a lot of what I did, and then I share tips for other people. Like, there should be a why. There should be a what's in it for you. There should be a what's in it for them. There should be a call to action. What do you want people to do with this? Do you want them to laugh, cry, think, groan? Do you want them to learn something? Do you want them just to be entertained? Those things are very important. And then the critical thinking exercise at the end is, what is your why? All those things that I just told you, what's your version of it? And there will be a worksheet where they write down all these things. So by the end of the course, which has 14 modules, they will have a rough idea of, if I do start a podcast, this is what it's going to look like. This is why I'm making it. This is what I want to do with it. This is how often I want to publish it, etc.
They can't be understated, the importance of why, because as someone who has started 3 separate podcasts outside of the one my business currently runs, they fade away and they change. And they're all good. I really enjoyed the experience of all of them, but I use them for different purposes in my own career path. And I have to encourage people that your why will probably change. Hence why you created a second episode about your why.
I'll tell you something that my podcasting coach taught me, and that is a podcast is a recipe, not a statue. And you were talking about things changing. Podcasts change. Say I start my podcast like I did, alternating solo shows and interview shows. That was my whole rotation, solo show, interview show for a year or more. And then I started making series. I would have 3 or 4 part series instead of alternating solo shows and interview shows. And then I would have series mixed in with all kinds of solo shows and interview shows too. For example, my pronunciation series, I changed my recipe. I just didn't necessarily tell people. But here's the important thing, I always show up on Friday. They don't know what they're going to get, but when they get something that they weren't expecting, they realize the recipe has changed, but I keep showing up on Friday. I think the frequency with which you show up to your podcast is part of your recipe. And if you don't change that part, people will keep showing up to eat whatever you're serving.
Hmm. Do you think that people will take this course from a perspective of wanting to grow something outside of their job or within their job?
Both. I think I don't really see it as a binary decision. I don't see it as one or the other. I think that at first you have to start somewhere, right? And it doesn't have to be perfect. That's just my opinion. Okay. Everybody else can have whatever opinion they want. But from my perspective, a podcast can be started with an idea in mind. For example, the Happy PharmD podcast, and you're talking about coaching stuff and best practices for maybe you're talking about how the sausage is made, how to coach somebody. I know that's not what you do right now, but then maybe you decide to change it and you want some testimonials. So you start bringing in people that you have coached and you have interviews. You now have solo shows and interview shows. You talk about coaching, you talk about success stories. And then you're like, oh, I just want to change it a little bit more. And I want to talk about my services that I offer. And you're talking about the biz of the biz. I think anybody can start with an idea and grow it. I think mindset is more important than anything because when you have the mindset that this thing's a statue and you can't change, you need to take that statue and throw it on the concrete and break it in order to start a brand new one. And gosh, it can't even be on the same channel. No, that's not true. You can rebrand your podcast. Big name celebrities have rebranded their podcasts so that it's still the same person, but it's a different name. You can even rename your podcast. You can change the episode artwork. There's so many things you can do. It's a recipe, not a statue.
But you better follow that recipe if you want good cupcakes.
If the listeners like what you're serving, if the listeners like your cupcakes, then yeah, you better keep serving those cupcakes if they're expecting those cupcakes. But here's the thing, I have people that come to me privately through LinkedIn or other social media, emails, contact forms on my website, and they say, I want you to do this thing. And I think, oh, okay, I'll include that in my podcast. At the time, here's an example. I have a lot of international listeners, and a lot of them want to know, how can I become an American pharmacist? How can I get a job being a pharmacist in the United States? And I got that question so many times that I reached out to somebody at NABP and I said, how do I answer this question? Can you come on my podcast and explain this? And they did. I had Maureen Garrity from NABP come to my podcast and explain that. I've had people, students from my other online course, Pronounce Drug Names Like a Pro. How do you pronounce this drug name? And boom, I put it on the podcast. It's a whole entire episode. Those are things that I do. I take requests, Alex. I take requests.
That's kind of the fun part about podcasting is it introduces you typically to so many amazing people and so many cool opportunities. Every time I've done a podcast, it's always led me to some accolade that I would have never dreamed of. And it sounds like that's the same, for you. One of the crazy benefits of having your podcast.
I do like the relationships with people, them reaching out, telling me things. Accolades are nice, absolutely.
Sure.
But more than anything, it's nice to know that people are listening and they're sometimes liking it on social media, commenting on it, sharing it. But they like my show so much. Sometimes people want to be on it and they reach out. And that is how I ended up with a couple of guests. And it was kind of fun because I ended up creating entire series around those guests.
Hmm.
Dimple Gandhi is an example. She's a makeup artist and she's also a pharmacist who works in the pharmaceutical industry. And she pitched me and she said, "Hey, I'd like to be on your podcast. I do this really different thing. Would you be interested in having me on your podcast?" And I thought, boy, that topic's almost too much fun, makeup artist, right? But then I thought, my birthday month's coming up, which was July. And I thought, I've always wanted to have Danielle Paradin and Leslie Hodge on my podcast. And they are stylists, personal stylists, and among other things. And I thought, why don't I just put together this whole series about pharmacists in the beauty industry or the beauty space?
Sure.
And I did. And I did. Sometimes people reach out to me and I end up putting them on my show. And in Dimple's case, I built a whole series around it. She inspired me.
That's kind of the beauty of podcasting. I'm actually going to a podcast conference in a week. And every time I go, I always get introduced to amazing people that are doing really cool things. And there's collaborations that have happened because of it, partnerships, friends, clients. It is such a cool, like, extroverted mode for business and opportunity, even if you are not an extrovert, which you don't need to be in order to have a podcast. You just need to be able to talk, which is pretty easy to do.
Hillary Blackburn once told me that somebody described podcasters as gregarious. And I would agree. That's a great term to describe us. Extroverted, enjoy talking to people, all that. Are you going to Podcast Movement? Is that what you're going to?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Awesome.
Are you?
Have a great time. No, I wish.
Oh, there's like 3,000 gregarious people all in one place. And it's a party every day. Yeah, it's loads of fun. I have, I know the founder of there. So I get to help out a little bit and behind the scenes. And the whole time is just a giant party with talkers. And so it can be draining for those introverted people, but in most cases, it's a lot of fun.
I'm happy for you.
What would you say the biggest mistake is when people are considering to start a podcast?
I would say the biggest mistake people make when they're starting a podcast is not assessing their available time to create a podcast versus how much time it actually takes.
I know that you're just starting this, and because it's in the future, I don't know the exact timeline, but when will you be accepting people into this?
As soon as I can get it started. I honestly, when I put I want to say it's my spring update on my podcast back at the end of May, I think it was May 31st, I said, I'm going to have this new online course ready to go by the end of August. And I have the outline ready to go. I just need to record the videos. And it's going to be a video-based course, not audio. And I'm not necessarily going to have everything with presentations, but what I want to do is have voicemail length messages where I'm getting the key concepts. And I'm a very direct person. If anybody's ever listened to this podcast, you will know that I am a very direct person. And I like to get to the meat, because here's the thing. I am directing this course to pharmacists. I am making this course for pharmacists. Pharmacists in pharmacy school, y'all know that our professors would preach to us for that 45 or 50-minute session. If you had questions, you show up to office hours. This course is very similar.
Sorry, for everyone, the pause. I rolled my eyes because of the description of pharmacy school. Yeah, it's a problem, but not with Kim. Not with Kim. You can edit this out. but sorry, I didn't mean to cause you to pause, but I was like, oh yeah, pharmacy school.
Yeah, well, in pharmacy school, they were very direct. They told you what you need to know,
Yep.
and that was their flavor of it, right?
Yeah.
Their take on it. And then it's up to you to process it. And if you have questions, you either do your own research or you show up to office hours. And I'm not having office hours. I have very limited time to work with my voiceover business and my podcast that I keep up with and having this online course. But I do want to consider if anybody's interested to have small cohorts of students for 12 weeks at a time to train with me to create their podcast, to start a podcast. I have never done this before. That's not the intent of this course. But if there's enough interest, I'll do it. I'll try it. I will take up to 4 students. 4 is my lucky number. I think that's a good number to start with. And within 12 weeks, you will have a podcast. Now, if anybody wants to coach one-on-one with me, I will take 1 student every 60 days. And that's a real pressure cooker. But here's the thing. I could literally record somebody today, put it up in whatever podcast host they want to use. It will get them listed in Apple Podcasts, and it'll start listing in all the directories immediately. Now, I don't know how long anything gets through Apple Podcasts these days. It could take 2 days, it could take 2 weeks. I don't know. But the point is, if you just hire a concierge podcasting service to have you show up to the mic and just record something, you can do that. You don't need me. But if you want to coach with me, I can record the first one for you to get you in a directory. And then I can record the second one for you at some point to establish a pattern, like a monthly pattern, for example. And then that 60-day limit that I'm saying, in 60 days, you'll have a podcast, that will force you to do it because I'm not doing any more for you. I will do 2 for you, 1 to get you listed, 1 to establish your monthly pattern. And then by the end of the 60 days, you need to get that 3rd podcast up to keep your pattern. And if you can't do it, maybe this isn't for you, or maybe you need to work with me one-on-one in addition. So I do have some packages that I'm trying to put together. The whole purpose of this online course is not necessarily for me to go into coaching, but it will spur interest. And if anybody's interested, I'm interested in coaching.
So if people are interested in this course, where can they go to get it?
All right. This course can be found in 2 places. First place is kimnewlove.com. The second place is thepharmacistvoice.com. Click on the store tab and it will take you to kimnewlove.com. That's where you can find it. Again, it's called A Behind the Scenes Look at the Pharmacist Voice podcast.
Anything else you'd like to share about this course, your first cohort?
Well, this course is self-paced and you can enter it at any time. We all know that pharmacists have crazy schedules, so you can take it anytime that it's convenient for you. And there's going to be 14 modules. I don't know how long it's going to take to go through because, like I said, I have not filmed everything yet, which I'm embarrassed about. I really wanted to have this done by August 31st, but hey, I'll be talking about it on the podcast once it launches. The modules are, I'm going to read them to you right off my sheet here. There's a welcome module. Lesson 1 is why start a podcast. Lesson 2 is how I started my podcast. Lesson 3 is how long it takes an episode to go from idea to published. Lesson 4 is major purchases and time commitments, including audio engineering, software, computers, microphones, headphones, and more. Lesson 5 is research for solo and interview episode creation. Lesson 6 is how I create solo and interview podcast episodes. Lesson 7 is all about writing, what you need to know about writing episode titles, episode numbers, and show notes. Lesson 8, how to create podcast episode artwork and individual episode artwork, and when to use each one. Lesson 9, podcast host basics. This is like Libsyn, Buzzsprout, etc. Lesson 10, making a podcast website. Lesson 11, advertising new episodes. And the 13th module is review and wrap up. The 14th module is additional services, such as coaching with me, mic checks, things like that. There's a lot more I could say, but that's a little bit about the course. I would like to set the price at $50, but I have not completely decided on it yet. I want to make this very affordable, and Back to you, Alex.
Well, it sounds like now's the time to sign up, right? Get in while it's at its beginning phase and not when it's much higher priced.
Yeah, I have a feeling the price will go up, but I'm going to start it off at $50. That's what I think I'm going to do. Now, I am looking for beta testers. I think that's very important to mention too. Beta testers, let's say for $50. There you go. And I'm looking for 10 to 20 beta testers that will try it and let me know what you think, what's missing, what you like, what you don't like, etc.
Sounds like a great deal. Better do it now.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Alex, for putting me in the hot seat on my own podcast and asking those great questions. Now, as you can tell from the interview, the course is not on the market yet, but it will be available this fall. Looking back on it, when Aaron Albert told me that I should look into starting a podcast back in April of 2019, I had to make the decision to start a podcast or not. I have been in your shoes. Now, if someone had offered me a way to look behind the scenes of their podcast to see what I was getting myself into, I would have jumped at the chance. I did not know what I was doing. It took a little while to find my path. Now, if you are struggling with the decision to start a podcast or not, keep my online course in mind. During my course, you will learn about all the moving parts of a podcast. There are many ways to start a podcast. Now, you will see how I have applied as many moving parts as I used to my podcast. I literally show you behind the scenes of my podcast. Now, as we go through the modules, you will fill out a worksheet that will become the blueprint for your own podcast. That is a huge benefit of taking this course. If you take my course, it will help you decide if you want to start a podcast or not. It's not an easy decision. And I know how distracting it can be to see start a podcast on your to do list for months or years. I've been there. You just need to decide if you want to move on or do the dang thing. I get it. I was there in April 2019. I had to make that decision too. More than 170 podcast episodes later, I am glad that I chose to start my podcast. Once you have a podcast, you'll finally be able to communicate to your audience. And it's a great feeling. And I really think you'll love it. Now, if you choose not to start a podcast, that's okay. It's not quitting. You will actually save hundreds, if not thousands of dollars in equipment and tools. And let me tell you, you'll save many, 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 many hours of your time, which you could spend working on other goals. I help pharmacists decide if they want to start podcasts. And if they do, I point them in the right direction to get started making that podcast. I can work with them one on one or in small groups, or there's plenty of other options, which I mention in the course. I personally feel like there needs to be a pharmacist who helps other pharmacists with podcasting. I am stepping up to be that person. If you are interested in learning from me, send me a message via the contact form on my website, and I'll put you on the waiting list to be a beta tester for $50. I already have 3 people on the waiting list. I'm looking for 17 more. Just go to thepharmacistvoice.com and send me a message. Let's wrap up this series, shall we? Thank you for listening to my Back to School series on the Pharmacist Voice podcast. If you missed any of the interviews, go to thepharmacistvoice.com, click on the podcast tab, and look for episodes 165 through 174. Episode 165 was the introduction, and all the others in that 166 to 174 range feature pharmacists who teach online. Just real quick, those pharmacists are Dr. Beju Shah from the Pharmacy Informatics Academy, Dr. Blair Thielemeyer from the Pharmapreneur Academy, Dr. Jimmy Pruitt from Pharmacy and Acute Care University, Dr. Asha Bohannon from Impact Pharmacist Online Course and PGX Ally Program, Dr. Adam Martin from Script Your Brand Online Course, Dr. Kelly Karlstrom, or Dr. Kelly C. PharmD. She teaches Enjoy Learning Oncology, or ELO, courses. Dr. Stu Beatty from the Pharmacist Provider, Dr. Ashley Walker from Speed Signing with Dr. Ashley R. Walker and Preparing for OTC Hearing Aids, and finally me, Kim Newlove. I talked about a behind the scenes look at the Pharmacist Voice podcast. That's all I've got for you today. Please read the show notes for links to those pharmacists and their online courses. Join me this Friday, September 2nd, for my first solo show in about a month. It's my summer update. I'll talk to you then.